I am honored to introduce you Amy Fong from Hackett Group.
Thank you, Roy. I appreciate that. So thanks, everyone, for getting up this morning and making it here. I know it was probably a rough night after the Big Bang and everything last night. We had a really good day yesterday, I thought, where we talked about innovation. We talked about some of the macro things going on. What I wanted to do today was bring it a little bit more back to procurement. And because I'm from Hackett, for those of you who know Hackett, we've got data. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on going through a bunch of charts and numbers, and we know Roy doesn't like that. But I do want to talk about what we need to do and the imperative for change that we have in our industry and in all of our roles, whether you're a sourcing person, whether you're a CPO, an AP person, treasury, whatever. We all have an imperative for change right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the digital imperative and a stakeholder-centric approach. And then we're going to talk about what agility really means and how it is a business enabler. We'll talk about where we struggle, some of the changes or some of the challenges that we're facing. Hopefully these numbers don't apply to everyone in this room because I think you guys are probably a little ahead of the curve, but they do apply to the overall market, and I don't think anyone has done this really, really well yet. And then we'll talk about some tips just for inspiring the change and where we get started. All right, so what does digital transformation really look like for the enterprise? We talked a lot yesterday about the external landscape and how things are changing, and all of that proves out when we look at the data. So we have intensifying competition, we have disruptive innovation. We look at, we used to talk about like what Uber has done to taxi drivers. Now I think we can pick up an example of that in any industry. It's not just tech-type services, it's across the board. Innovation that's disrupting the way we do business. We also have higher business expectations, and this is not new, but it's been creeping up over time. So when we talked about, Christian talked a lot yesterday about the consumer expectations and how our personal lives are so much easier than our work lives, right? And that kind of creeps into everything. It's not just millennials, it's all of us, right? We want to buy something on Amazon at home, and then we go to work and we're like, you have to do a requisition and it's ridiculous, right? So those expectations have changed quite a bit. But they've also changed in the external perspective of how people select and buy things from organizations, right? We all have, I think, a much higher expectation in terms of the feedback we get from our companies than we did even 5 years ago. I mean, who goes and talks on a Twitter feed, right? Tweets on a company's Twitter feed when they're unhappy with their airline or anybody that they bought something from, right? So consumer expectations as well as B2B expectations have changed quite a bit. Excuse me. What comes from this, and when we react to this, we need to take a customer-centric approach. So there's a lot of tools we can take, we can use, we can engage our customers, we can individualize our process, we can have an omni-channel approach to anything we're doing. What it comes down to, though, is designing from the inside out, or from the outside in. Designing from what your customers need, what their expectations are. I find this especially difficult in procurement when we've always looked at savings as our main measurement. When you're really designing from your stakeholder needs, their needs are almost never savings at the top of the list. That's like 5 or 6. So what are their needs? Well, it's going to be different for every single stakeholder, and that's a really complex discussion that we all have to have and work into our business models. We also have a change in terms of digital operations and digital insights. So digital operations are kind of all these new tools and the way that we do things. Insights are the way we look at the information that we have. And I'll talk a little bit more about these. When we talk about how companies are changing, the data really proves this out. This is just a quick look, an analysis that was done a couple years back of the lifespan of companies in the S&P 500. And if you look at this, back in the 70s through the 90s, there's about 30 years that you'd be on the S&P 500, and then you'd sort of, most companies kind of go off at a point and compress. In the 90s to the 2010s, it was about 20 years, and now in the last 15 years or 10 years and going forward, it's down to about 15 years. So that's just a shrinking of the life cycle of both products and services and a company. We call that the churn rate, and it's been cut in half. And the interesting thing about this, I think a lot of people look at this data, or any data like this in that last slide with some of the competition, and they think it's all tech companies. Well, when you look at the data, it was actually across all industries. So CPG, industrials, pretty much any industry you're in likely has this faster churn rate than it used to. So that's really important to think about. What we see as the differentiating factor, because you may be thinking, what's driving this? Is it actually product life cycles? Is it the types of things that is it the delivery mechanism? It's really the ability to adapt to external change. That was the main differentiator. So agility, right? We talked a little bit about agility yesterday. I want to define it a little better for us. It's really the ability to anticipate and respond to the outside rate of change. So if we look at hyper competition and volatility and disruptive innovation, how do we respond to it as an organization? We need to be able to respond fast enough that we're keeping up with that rate of change internally. So things like having a digital value network, having an information-driven, proactive decision-making process, and being customer-centric and responsive in our operations. So there's really 4 characteristics or attributes that we see in those companies that are very agile. They start with customer centricity. That guides their planning processes. It guides all their business decisions. They sit back and they ask, what would the customer do? Operational responsiveness. That helps them to respond to the changes in the supply chain. Information-driven, proactive decision-making. So they're leveraging information, they're leveraging predictive analysis to improve the quality of their business decisions and the timing of their business decisions. And then they're industry leading in terms of digitizing their value chain. And I'll look at what kind of that network versus value chain looks like in just a minute as well. So what does this mean for source to pay? And I know for a lot of people, we talk about kind of the enterprise, and it's hard to bring that back to what has traditionally been a back office function, right? Especially if you're in the purchase to pay area and you're just trying to get the invoices out and answer your inquiries from a lot of customers and suppliers looking for their checks and all of that. And hopefully you're not using checks, hopefully they're e-payments of some sort. But however you're doing that, a lot of it is just keeping up with the day-to-day. In order to switch around, you've really got to start, like I said earlier, with that customer-centric approach, but build a foundation of analytics-driven insights. And then there's 4 pillars that we view that you need to look at from a digital perspective. You need to look at your stakeholder experience. So what's an omni-channel personalized experience? It means I can get what I need in whatever form is right for me. For some people, that's going to be high-touch concierge-like service, right? Your CEO needs something, you're probably going to answer the phone, hopefully. And even for a more junior level person who has high needs that are very complicated and need to be specced out. For some, it means mobile. For some, it means an online. For some, it's a chat bot, right? So getting that information and engaging with your customers in the way that's right for them. Digitally enabling your workforce. So having these tools in place so that your workforce can work digitally. Again, customer preferences and working online and being able to do things digitally is not just for your customers, it's internal as well. Nobody wants to be pushing paper in this day and age in their role, right? So this helps you to attract better talent. It also streamlines and captures your information. Smart orchestration of your source-to-pay services. So if you think of it more of a catalog, and IT has been good at doing this for a while, thinking of a catalog of the services that they offer, offering that out. You are a service provider within your organization and to your external market. You are not a siloed function that's looking just to complete a process. And then an ecosystem of network solutions. So again, the connectivity here, right? It's all about connectivity with your customer, your external customer, your internal customer, and your suppliers. And procurement plays a big role in that. So part of digital transformation, though, and the part that I often think we forget is the non-technical part. And Christian showed a Casio watch yesterday, and I thought that was a great example, right? If we're just doing the technology, we're not doing digital transformation. We're not transforming at all. If you really want to transform and you want to capture the ultimate value from your digital transformation, you need to move beyond just automating. You need to design completely new ways of doing things. You need to enable yourself with new technologies. So whether it just be cloud, whether it's RPA, whether it's social media, big data, there's a lot of different technologies out there, cognitive tools. But think about how you design those from the inside out, taking a customer-centric approach, right? If you're still looking at how do I just automate my process, you're probably missing out on the end goal. design new ways to engage the customer, both your internal and your external customers. External customers have a lot of information that we need in the supply chain to do better. So we should be capturing that. If you're not getting any voice of your external customer and it's not filtering its way back to procurement or just to AP or to P2P or to supply chain, you're missing out. You're missing important sources of information. And finally, and the one that I think is probably the hardest culturally, is this velocity of change. So this idea of a fast-fail philosophy, or a fast-fail mentality. The companies that I think are doing this really well, they execute a lot of pilots in different areas, and they scale up. They may have 5 different vendors out there doing RPA for bots, and they know that they're only going to pick 2, but they're okay with that. They're okay with a lot of the things they try failing, as long as they learn from it and they move on. And I just don't think that corporate culture is really there for most of us yet, right? There's a high price of failure still in a lot of organizations. So getting your people to kind of move past that, as a leader, moving past that, giving people the room to try new things is incredibly important to make this successful. Excuse me, part of that is also shifting your focus. So you're not thinking this as discrete projects, right? We're going to do this and this and this. We're going to continuously transform. And some of the panel yesterday, the customer panel, had great points about, we've chosen a partner that is going to be continuously transforming and continuously evolving the technology. And they view Tradeshift as that partner, which is great. That is an excellent way to do this. You don't have to be developing all this technology in-house. You should be partnering. But the idea is not that it's going to be static. It's that it's going to continue to be enhanced. So we talk about all these cognitive tools and blockchain and a lot of things that aren't quite mature yet, but they're being developed. And I think the technology providers in our field are doing an excellent job of vetting those things and figuring out where the value is and where to work them in. And maybe they try a few things and they have a fast fail, and then they learn from that and implement something new. And that's all okay, because we're in an environment where the technology is evolving so quickly that we have to keep trying new things, and we have to be open to that and open to taking a risk and then moving on and learning from it and then implementing the next thing. So if you have a platform provider or an application provider that can provide that can give you that and help you with that, that's even better. It starts internally as well, and not being penalized for those kind of changes. So I want to talk just a little bit about where we are today, because I think all of this looking forward and all the innovation talk yesterday is great, but the reality is that I think we all have to come to grips with is that we're not really there yet. We're pretty far away when we look at the actual data of what is happening in companies today. And I think we're all going to conferences. We're all doing a lot of talking about this. And that's great. We're learning. But in terms of the actual implementation of the technology that we've bought, we're still pretty low. So if I look across the board, this is just our metrics from ERFP, from sourcing all the way to e-payments, electronic payments, and spend visibility. That world-class number is the top 15% of companies. They are not at 95 to 100% automation. Even the best of the best aren't there yet, right? And these numbers are kind of changing very slowly. We have a new P2P study coming out this summer, so if you're interested in taking that and charting yourself, it'll be open to the public. But what we mostly see is the peer companies, the other 80-some%, that are still very low in terms of their percent of automated transactions, right? Down in the 40s, the 30s, the 60s. I mean, what this shows me is that most companies, they have bought some kind of technology, but they're running parallel processes internally. They're running on these new systems that they've implemented for 20% of their suppliers, 40%, 60%, not enough, right? And they're still running on paper. So they're dealing with very manual processes, and you're not getting the full value. And what you're really missing out on is that information, right? Because anything you put in that's truly a machine learning type tool or cognitive tool needs a complete set of information to be effective. So with kind of partial information, not clean, not complete, you're not going to be successful. So getting up to full automation is a big piece of this. I'm going to talk about that more in a second, because I think we've been taking the wrong approach. The other piece is in the financial supply chain. Technology implementation challenges, supplier onboarding has been a big challenge for a lot of companies, and slow adoption of networks has really slowed down adoption of financial supply chain tools as well. So we only see about 23% using trade financing and 16 using dynamic discounting. Now, 100% of companies don't necessarily need these, but it's a whole lot more than those that are using it right now. Some of the reasons, we found only about half of companies have any kind of strategy around discounts. Half aren't even thinking about this. Now, again, you can have a strategy that says we're rarely going to take discounts, we're going to push out our payment, or we're going to use supply chain financing for everything, and we're not going to offer discounts. That's fine, but not having a strategy at all is like we haven't even thought about it, and that's very common. That's typically what I see when I talk to people. We also found, and this is a bit more concerning, that 49% of companies say their processes just aren't efficient enough to support a treasury solution. Meaning, yeah, maybe this is something we'd like to do, but we just can't handle it, right? It's still taking us 28 days to approve an invoice, or even more in some cases, right? So if we're dealing half in paper, we don't have something electronic that we can, push out to the supplier back and forth and have a quick transaction on, we don't even have the opportunity to take advantage of a lot of the value that's sitting in the supply chain. So these are really big gaps. And I don't mean to bring everybody down, but I think it's important to acknowledge where we are, because I think we can make leaps and bounds at this point in terms of moving forward in our automation. So what is it going to take? It's a broader change, right? One thing is, I think that the approach we've taken in terms of automating our process has really failed us. We need to look at the network. We need to look at connectivity and information exchange across all of our partners and start with that. Because again, when you have only 20 or 30 or 40% of your suppliers on your e-invoicing solution, you're in parallel processes and you're not going to get the value. So when you take a different look and you say, hey, my suppliers are kind of my customer too, what do I need to put in place so that they are communicating with me digitally and it's easy for them? Everything else kind of follows after that, right? So process automation just isn't enough. It's just looking at your internal efficiencies. We need to take that external approach that looks at, or that network approach that looks externally. Source to pay is really a window. We are in a unique position, right? Being in between our stakeholders and the external market suppliers. When I talk to category managers, they're kind of like, how do I know more than the engineer I'm talking to, my internal stakeholder? Well, you know a lot more. You can look across the organization. You can look at the external market. You can see what's coming down the pipe. You should be gathering a lot of market intelligence and data from that market. So you should have a lot more information. But that information needs to be available. It needs to flow freely. And our internal data with our suppliers needs to flow freely as well. So we're missing a lot there. We need to really think about that information approach. Because again, without that, without complete and correct information, we're going to be hindered in anything we can do in the digital world. So ultimately what we need is these digitally integrated value networks. What's in this picture is really kind of just a picture or just an illustration, but essentially it's no longer a straight value chain, right? It's a web and a network of connectivity across all of the partners, whether they be a demand signal, a supply signal, business enablement partners that are providing talent or that are providing process support, third-party service firms, whatever it may be, we need to be digitally connected. And that is where we need to start. So we're also going to see a lot of opportunity, I think, in our space from emerging technologies. And we're starting to see some of this already. I think there's a lot of examples out there. I'm not going to go through all of the possibilities because you'll see some of those ideas yesterday and today in some of the sessions. But when you think about mobility, what that can do for us, RPA's already offered a lot for a lot of companies in terms of taking out manual process steps and kind of connecting where you have older systems, moving that swivel chair activity out. Cognitive tools and artificial intelligence, huge opportunity there, I think. When I think about category cockpits and how somebody who's managing a supply in a market could just see everything and be able to act on it with hopefully predictive tools and a huge amount of visibility that they don't have today. That's a huge opportunity, and I think that the providers are doing a great job of building these things in, but we need to be ready for it, right? We need to be ready to adopt it, as well as things like predictive modeling. So the best examples I've heard is that when we have a better idea, or at least a draft idea, of what our stakeholders are going to spend next year before we go talk to them. And when we can get to that point of looking forward instead of looking backwards and looking backwards at an incomplete picture, we have much more power in the market. We have much more opportunity to really find the value. So the one thing that we get asked quite often is, what is this going to do to the workforce? What is this going to do to procurement? And this is an analysis that I feel is fairly rough, but I think it's indicative of the future in terms of what's going to happen to various areas of the source-to-pay value chain. Structured work, things like AP and PO processing, the administrative tasks are going to be very automated, right? And we've seen that coming for a long time. We should really only be managing exceptions at this point. We're not there, but ultimately that's where we should get to. Knowledge work, I think when we think about routine work, like sourcing execution, quite a bit of that sourcing execution can become automated. We don't necessarily need somebody to go in there and manually set up every single sourcing event as if it's a completely new from scratch thing, right? So there's a lot of opportunity to streamline that as well. And then when we think about the harder things, the interactive work, supplier management, stakeholder management, innovation, there's opportunities to really streamline the way we do that by getting more information. So I kind of think of it as there are some areas in the transactional space that we're going to probably free up people altogether, right? There are other roles, when we think about what category managers do or supplier managers, where they're going to get better information that they can make decisions, better decisions on faster. So we're not going to necessarily eliminate those roles. They're going to be able to cover more, and they're going to be able to cover it better. So when I look at an analysis like this, this is kind of the potential, workforce productivity, and it's in terms of FTEs, where you're going down about half the number of FTEs to execute. But I think realistically, we are not going to cut the number of people in procurement by half. That's not what this means, at least not if you're doing it right. Right? So what we should be doing is enhancing our productivity so that we can do better. We can go deeper. We can spend more time with our stakeholders. We can spend more time with our suppliers. And when we think about where are you going to be tomorrow, are you going to move those people into innovative roles, whether it's the same people or a swap out and you're rearranging, the seats, are you going to move those people into roles where they can really drive that innovation? And innovation, for the most part, is a person-to-person type thing, right? You're not getting that through the computer. I mean, you can certainly use cognitive intelligence and lots of deep data analysis to come up with and to drive better decisions. But the value that we get when we talk about higher value is being out there, talking to your stakeholders, understanding their needs, talking to your suppliers, understanding those capabilities, and matching the two up. It's people skills. So when we look at the skills that are really important, it's understanding the data, it's relationships, it's really bringing out the best in your people and bringing out the best in your suppliers. So I think it begs the question when we look at sort of these data estimates of how productive we're going to be, of what is the additional value that you're going to get out of those FTEs when they have better information and more time. So I want to wrap up because I think what I always get from this is, all right, where do we start? And as a leader, some of these things are not necessarily steps that are clearly on the roadmap. We can all go out and pick out technology, that's important, but what else do we need to do? So stakeholders first. Understand your customer strategy, your priorities. What are their priorities? What are the goals that they have? I always ask people first thing in category management training, what are the top 5 priorities of your stakeholder, the budget owner for your category? Most of them can't answer that off the top of their head. That's a huge flaw in the way we're doing things, right? So you need to understand that. You need to be prepared to have those conversations. You need to build the relationships to have those conversations. Because again, these are people skills. These aren't just, doing a report. Now, data can help you accelerate that relationship. It can help you give more visibility into your stakeholders, just like knowing your market can. But you still have to have the opportunity and the trust to have that conversation. Pilot and learn. So rapidly evaluating activities, whether you have a partner and you're evaluating with them, if you're coming to events like this, you're looking at the solution demos out there and you're understanding. I mean, it's shocking to me how many people have an issue with technology and it's a feature or a function they just haven't turned on in their current platform, right? So they're not necessarily out there trying new things. They're not looking, they're just running it and trying to optimize on what they have. So understanding what's available, taking the risk to pilot it, and then demonstrating wins. If you have 10 pilots and 3 wins, that's great. Talk up those wins, right? But having that kind of attitude and taking that approach is not common today. And I think it's even more important now. Think about your strategy and roadmap. So if you haven't updated your roadmap in the past few years, go back and take a look at it with a digital eye. It's very likely missing some things. Hopefully everyone in here has done this because you're all here and you're innovation focused, right? But often the technology is moving so fast that we don't necessarily know where we can fit it in. So being aware of that, people ask me all the time about blockchain and whether they should be adopting it now. And blockchain is a tricky subject, right? And it's kind of still evolving. And I'm not saying yes or no, but just because it's not quite ready maybe to be adopted by everybody in this room doesn't mean you shouldn't be keeping your eye on it and reading about it and learning about it and going to conferences and attending webcasts and being aware. And then when you find the right opportunity, you apply it. Right? So a lot of this is about being ready and being educated. Education. So this is not educating yourself, but it's educating the organization as leaders. So we have a role as leaders in source-to-pay to keep our teams abreast of what's happening in the industry and help them understand where the bar is right now. So if they think that just working in this silo and processing transactions and answering the phone on inquiries is their job, they're off base, right? The job has changed. We spend a lot of time doing competency assessments to help people on teams, right? The entire organization understand what the expectations are for that job in 2020, and then helping them build a roadmap to, or a development plan to get to it, because the job has changed. So we have a role in educating people and bringing them along for the journey. Continuous alignment. So again, as you've developed that roadmap with your stakeholders, you've got to go back. You've got to be continuously updating it. You've got to be asking them what they need and how that's changed, because their world is changing too. So you're not going to get a point in time and come back in 12 months for next year's plan. There's got to be interim steps, and it's got to be an open dialogue. And then finally, know your talent. So I just mentioned competency models and changing job descriptions and education and all of that. And I think there's some tough decisions there. I think that most people are ready to change and are interested in changing. But you've got to, there is work to be done in figuring out where people will fit into the new roles in the future, right? It doesn't mean that that we're laying off a lot of people and we're reducing headcount. It means that we're shifting people around and we're educating them. And we've got to figure out who's going to be the person that's going to go into our center of excellence and build out our digital strategy and implement cognitive tools, and who is going to be the person that's the recipient of those tools and is out there working with our stakeholders and our suppliers on a day-to-day basis, because they have the relationship skills and maybe not the technical skills. There's a role for most people in the organization, but to be a great leader in this world, you've got to understand people and you've got to understand the characteristics they bring to the table and how to optimize those. And I think that more and more is important as roles change. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. I have a minute left for questions, and then Roy's probably going to come pull me off for his next story. But I enjoyed hearing all this, or hearing everybody yesterday, and hearing the sessions, and interested to hear any questions and thoughts that you have. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to ask questions. I'll ask one. So, great presentation. So, my background is supplier and retailer. So, one of the things I've experienced is that when I think about digitizing processes where I've been previously, we've got a lot of core processes that are not ideal. So, and it's not the case with probably any customer in this room, but at least where I'm working.
Everybody else is good.
How do you think about kind of fixing your core processes at the same time you're digitizing core processes, and how do you talk to your clients?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky situation. I think that, especially in retail and certain industries, you probably have core systems that you can't just tear out either, right? It's not that maybe you can't replace your ERP, or maybe you can't replace, some industry systems that are sitting there. I think the first thing you need to do is, I think it always starts with that customer-centric approach, right? You have to start with, what is it that we're trying to execute on? And then you go into the technology and the processes and what needs to change. If you have restrictions with technology, I think that the tools that are available today, when we look at like robotic process automation, that can actually be the Band-Aid that you need, the splint that you need to connect the new systems with the old in some ways, to get to ultimately, hey, we have this underlying system where the user interface is not great, but we can put something over it that's a much better solution, and we can connect the two in a much lighter way. So I think looking outside of the traditional, we're gonna turn everything over, it's a good place to look, especially in certain industries. There are others where I would say just tear it all out. If you're in CPG and nobody cares what your ERP is, go in and start. I mean, you can't start from scratch, obviously, but there's a lot of better solutions, whether it's a source-to-pay platform or a cloud-based ERP or whatever you need to kind of rebuild that. But again, it's not just technology. You've got to be looking at it culturally, and you've got to be looking at the whole picture and bring everybody along on the journey. So if this just becomes we're just going to upgrade our platform perspective, you're not going to get there. You're not going to have that innovative environment where people have room to come up with, the big earth-moving ideas, right, that are going to really move the levers for you. So it's a little bit of both. Other questions? Yeah, Dan?
So your slide up there with the shrinking FTE. So I think a lot of us perceive that's happening, right?
Yeah.
Those FTEs, are those being repurposed? Are they going away? I mean, I can see
Yeah.
a lot of people being really scared by that slide.
Yeah.
And we get a lot of, I think it's all about change management, and the resistance comes from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm always hesitant to show those numbers because I actually think that the charts alone are not the right message. I think the better message is, look, we're going to gain a whole lot of productivity. And maybe, I didn't do that analysis. I would argue FTEs isn't the way to measure it. It's productivity, and it's the outputs that we can generate, right? So when we benchmark procurement organizations, world-class organizations use slightly fewer FTEs in the procurement process across the board than peers. They're more efficient, but they also pay those FTEs more. They're higher skilled. They're doing higher value work, right? So their costs aren't significantly lower, and their labor to technology ratio might be a little better, right? But they're using them to drive higher value and things beyond savings, and to build those relationships and to be innovative. I think when we see that, we need to think not how are we going to cut out half our FTEs, because that's the wrong direction. We need to think about where are we going to move people to the highest value possible, because there is all kinds of untapped value in the supply base and in procurement that we're not getting right now. And if we're just cutting FTEs, we're not going to get any better, right? We're not going to increase that value. ROI in a procurement organization is between 4 and 12x, depending on how good you are, right? Even if it's 2x, right? What other investment in your enterprise are you going to get a 4x return on? I mean, the CFO should be putting more resources towards procurement because it's one of the best bangs you can get for your buck. So what we need to do, though, is figure out what that bang is, because that bang isn't just savings. It's getting new products. It's doing better in the market. It's being more efficient in what we buy. There's all kinds of things. It's working capital too, right? And if we're just cutting FTEs, we're not really building the resources we need to meet that. So it's a good point on that slide. I'm always a little hesitant with that data. It's relatively new, but I think it's important to think about the productivity gains we're getting. Anybody else? See Roy on his way up.
Amy, thank you.
Right.
Thank you
Thanks
very
a lot.
much. That was wonderful.